We live in the richest society in human history, and so it's natural that so many of us would trust in our wealth, in our affluence, to be what saves us, what provides for us. Well, here's a psalm that's focused on wealth, and it's showing us the illusion that wealth is. That wealth promises a lot, but doesn't deliver much. And so, as we're focusing on this psalm, I want to be clear: we're not the kind of a church that we talk about, eating the rich, or how the rich people are bad inherently. That's simply not true, and it's not biblical. We don't condemn people because they're wealthy or they're poor, but I think wealth functions like a magnifying glass. It really amplifies certain characteristics that are already there, what's already in your heart. So if you're a generous person, wealth will give you a chance to be more generous. If you're loving, wealth can give you some more freedom to devote yourself to good causes. But if you're power hungry, wealth can just be an added weapon, something to use to control people or to harm people. If you're all about your own reputation, then wealth can allow you to build monuments to your name, literally or figuratively. So wealth just magnifies what's already in our hearts. But in this psalm, we're focusing on wealth in view of our impending death. That life is short and wealth is not a sufficient foundation to build your life on. And so this is good for us. Even if you don't consider yourself wealthy, you may be in regards to human history and even in regards to global wealth metrics. You may be one of the wealthier people in the world. So we're going to go through this psalm. It's a great psalm, very helpful and very reflective of the Proverbs. In fact, we see that kind of at the beginning, this sort of wisdom literature. So let's go through this section by section. So the first four verses 1 to 4, are a call to listen, a call to listen. Let's read it. Verse 1, hear this, all peoples, give ear, all inhabitants of the world, both low and high, rich and poor, together. So he says, hear, that's the first word of this psalm. And this is the same verb as the famous Shema in Deuteronomy 6, right? Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. So this is a call to heed something, to hear it, and to respond accordingly. And notice that this is focused on the entire world. He mentions the peoples, and then he mentions the world. And so he's looking globally, and we've seen this in other Psalms in this context, right? In this series of Psalms that we're in, there has been a lot of mention of the nations of the globe. Look back at Psalm 47, you'll see this. Psalm 47:1, clap your hands, all peoples. Or verse 3, he subdued peoples under us and nations under our feet. Or verse 9, the princes of the peoples gather as the people of the God of Abraham. So there was that vantage point in Psalm 47 of this gathering in of people from all over the world to become God's people. And here, again, there's this message going out that's for everyone. And he wants you to understand this message is for you. It's not just for a person that you know who's wealthy. This is for you. So he says, verse 2, both low and high, rich and poor together. So he takes contrasting things and he says, both of these need to listen up. Now, this is what's a figure of speech called a merism. And what that means is you take opposite things like heaven and earth, and together what they mean is the entirety of something, right? So heaven and earth means all of creation. Rich and poor, well, that's everyone. Everyone's either rich or poor. Everyone's either low or high. So these things are pointing to everyone. So the idea is this includes you, and the psalmist here, he's calling you to listen. He's calling you to listen. Verse 3, he says, my mouth shall speak wisdom. The meditation of my heart shall be understanding. I will incline my ear to a proverb. I will solve my riddle to the music of the lyre. So here he's saying that he's going to speak wisdom to us, and he wants us to listen. So that's the question. Will we listen to this wise person and what he has to say to us for our benefit? He says in verse 4, this is a riddle. He wants to solve this riddle. And that word, it's the same word used for Samson's riddle in Judges 14, when he tells that riddle about the honey and the lion, if you know the passage I'm speaking of. And so he's looking to address something very difficult, which is the powerful and the vulnerable and life and death and the stability of riches. And this is something difficult that needs to be explained. And so he's calling us at the beginning to listen up, to heed this, and to live our lives in response to this. So the first part is the call to listen, and then he gets into the meat of the psalm. So verses 5-9, he says, don't fear the wealthy. Don't fear the wealthy. Look at verse 5. Why should I fear in times of trouble when the iniquity of those who cheat me surrounds me, those who trust in their wealth and boast of the abundance of their riches? So he's saying, why should I fear when people are trying to cheat me, when their sin, their iniquity surrounds me? Well, isn't that answer kind of obvious? If someone's out to harm you, well, then this could lead to a lot of bad things. And there's a reason to be afraid, right? You could have financial losses. You could have reputational damage to you. You could have stress or problems with your family. Of course, this matters. But what he's saying, I think, here is the Bible often does is the Bible asks us questions that we think we know the answer to, but it calls us to ask them again and to re-examine our presuppositions, to look at our assumptions and say, is this true or not? Is it really worth fearing when people are trying to harm you? Why do we fear? Why would we be afraid of those who trust in their wealth? Is there actually anything that they're standing on that is stable? Or are they simply passing through temporary people that are going to fall someday? And of course, that's where this psalm is heading. So he helps us to examine this question in the following verses. So he's asked the question, why do I fear? Why should we fear? And he's going to answer. He's going to respond to it. He says, verse 7, truly no man can ransom another or give to God the price of his life. For the ransom of their life is costly and can never suffice, that he should live on forever and never see the pit. So again, wealth promises a lot, but does it actually deliver? Death makes our life worthless, in a sense, right? Because we can't buy eternal life. So if death is there, then everything we've built up, everything we've invested in becomes worthless because we cannot purchase the only thing that matters, which is a continuation of our lives. He uses this word ransom here, which is a word for obviously buying back something or someone. And he's saying we can't buy people, right? We can't afford to buy people because nothing that we have is worth the life of another who's made in God's image. But he goes further and he says that we can't even give to God the price for our own life. In other words, even the wealthiest person can't afford himself. You can't afford yourself. You cannot rescue yourself by the wealth that you have. Think about that. So wealth may be a tool given to us by God. It's neither good nor evil in and of itself, but trusting in it is incredibly foolish because it has very limited power and no power when it comes to spiritual things. This is why Jesus said in Mark 8:36, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? In other words, you can have all of these things, all of this outward success, but if you lose your life, if you perish eternally, none of that matters. And so he says, don't fear those who are wealthy. There's no reason to fear those who are wealthy. Then he goes on and he says in verses 10-20, don't trust in wealth. So not only don't fear those who are wealthy, but also don't put your trust, your dependence in riches. Verse 10, for he sees that even the wise die, the fool and the stupid alike must perish and leave their wealth to others. Not only can you not ransom yourself, but death makes all of the progress that you've made in life, it makes it worthless, right? And it means that there's an end that is coming that is inevitable. It doesn't matter what you've accomplished, you're going to leave your wealth to someone else. And Ecclesiastes talks about this, how people leave their wealth to others who squander it, who waste it, who do foolish things with it. So someone might spend their entire life working hard and never actually be able to enjoy what God has given to them. And he says here, wise men are the same as everyone else in their death. In other words, as we hear often, right? Death is the great equalizer. When you're dead, everyone is the same. Verse 11, their graves are their homes forever, their dwelling places to all generations, though they called lands by their own names. So these people used to have entire lands named after them. These are powerful, influential people. And yet he says, you won't have lands or even properties. All you will have is the grave in which you're placed. That will be your home forever. Now, I couldn't help thinking, but in Santa Cruz, even that amount of land is worth a lot of money. So, but that's not the point he's trying to make, right? He's trying to make the point the opposite. He's trying to say, this is not a glorious ending. This is nothing glamorous, and you have nothing to your name. And then he gives the refrain that's going to be repeated at the end of the psalm as well, in verse 12. Man in his pomp will not remain. He is like the beasts that perish. So a pompous and arrogant person, someone who's confident in themselves and in what they have, that person will not remain. That word remain is literally the word for lodging somewhere overnight. So what it's saying is, you spend your whole life working hard to make this perfect home for yourself, more metaphorically speaking, and you can't even stay in it a night. You will not survive, is the idea. No, at the end of it, we're just like animals. We perish. We're made of the same stuff. And so he says, man won't remain. He's just like an animal. He will perish. That is the end that we have to look forward to. Verse 13, he says, this is the path of those who have foolish confidence, yet after them people approve of their boasts. Self-reliance is a major danger in wealth. The more that you have, the easier it is to think that you have some sort of security in that wealth. Verse 14, he says, like sheep they are appointed for Sheol. Death shall be their shepherd, and the upright shall rule over them in the morning. Their form shall be consumed in Sheol, with no place to dwell. So death is personified here in an interesting way. He's kind of painting this picture of the living being like dumb sheep that are grazing while death is watching over them, and they're being kind of figuratively led out to pasture, right? They're heading towards disaster, not even knowing it. One commentator points out that this is basically saying that we're like sheep grazing, but at the end it says their form shall be consumed. Well, death is already grazing on us. Death is slowly eating away our lives and eventually will claim us forever. And so we're being watched over by someone or this force that wants to harm us. Remember when he says their form shall be consumed in Sheol, we see Sheol twice in this verse. That word Sheol refers to the grave. It's speaking of death. There's also a major turn of events, though, in verse 14, because he says the upright shall rule over them in the morning. So the righteous will rule over the wicked. What an encouragement this is to those who are poor and yet upright, or those who endure evil from others who are more powerful and yet they are upright. Even though there's a temporary victory for those who are wicked and powerful, in the end, the righteous are the ones who will be victorious. That's the message of this psalm. So righteousness endures in a much greater way. So don't trade eternal joys for temporary pleasures. Be like Moses, right, who we hear about in Hebrews 11, who didn't consider the fleeting riches and the fleeting pleasures of Egypt as being worthwhile, right? But he wanted to be part of God's people. Verse 15, he goes on, he says, but God will ransom my soul from the power of Sheol, for he will receive me. So we can't ransom ourselves, as we saw in verse 8, but God can ransom us. And notice that this verse is in the first person, right? This is kind of the first time we're hearing the first person voice being used. He's speaking of personal salvation. He's not just saying God's going to rescue us in a general sense. He's saying God's going to rescue me. God can and will rescue the individuals who put their trust in him. And he says he will receive me. This verb receive, it's a common verb, but it's the same verb as Genesis 5:24, where Enoch he walked with God and he was not, for God took him. That's that word took, is the word received. Or Psalm 73:24, you guide me with your counsel, and afterward you will receive me to glory. So this receiving, when we see verses like that, we see the same idea here in Psalm 49, that God is receiving into eternal life and into glory, into a lasting life. Verse 16, let's read a big chunk here. He says, be not afraid when a man becomes rich, when the glory of his house increases. For when he dies, he will carry nothing away. His glory will not go down after him. For though, while he lives, he counts himself blessed, and though you get praise when you do well for yourself, his soul will go to the generation of his fathers, who will never again see light. So here's the application at the end. The riddle has been unfolded, right? Wealth is not a solid ground to put your feet on, to rest on. It's not worth trusting in because it cannot save your biggest problems, and someday you will lose it all because of death, right? Death is the answer to all of these things. And so even though you may believe yourself to be blessed and you may you receive praise because of your prosperity, that won't endure. It won't last. And often in the pursuit of wealth, we miss the most important things that God has placed before us. Ralph Waldo Emerson said, money often costs too much. Money often costs too much. That pursuit of wealth and wanting to have those things of value, in the process, we lose so many other things. And so we're cautioned here to consider this. And then he ends this psalm with the repeated refrain from verse 12. Man in his pomp, yet without understanding, is like the beasts that perish. So in verse 12, he had said, man in his pomp is like the beasts that perish. And here he adds that phrase, yet without understanding. I think this clarifies for us what he's saying. He's not simply saying that we're like the beasts, that we die. He's saying if you live without understanding, even though you're arrogant, even though you're boastful, if you do not have wisdom and knowledge of God, all of wealth is pointless. And so there's a better hope and a better treasure for us in the good news of Jesus Christ. Unlike those who read this psalm originally, it's not a mystery to us how God is going to solve the problems that are here, which is that how is he going to give us life beyond the grave? How is he going to rescue us from the power of Sheol? Well, because we know Jesus, we understand these promises are fulfilled in him. Through his sacrifice on the cross, Jesus becomes a ransom for us to pay the price to God for our lives so we could be rescued from our sin. His life is valuable enough that it can suffice to pay for us. That's how valuable his life is. It can do what wealth never could do. And Jesus Christ rescues us from the power of death. Think about the famous words of John 3:16, maybe the most famous verse in the Bible. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. So there's a future, there's a possibility now for us, if we trust in Jesus, that we won't perish, that everything that we've done in this life won't become meaningless because we've died and we've gone into the grave. But there's an answer to the grave, and it's found only in Jesus. So take this to heart, right? Consider this proverb that's embedded in a psalm here. Meditate on it. And ask yourself, what am I trusting in? Am I trusting in wealth or some other thing in this world to provide what only God can provide? And I'd encourage you to turn to Jesus in faith. Thanks so much for watching this video. We're uploading great biblical content every single week, so make sure you subscribe, like this video, and leave a comment down below. We'd love to discuss with you. If you want to support us financially, there's a link in the description of this video. Thanks so much.